Good morning, world. I'm Steve Rao, the host of Pod and Roku TV's World Edition. And on this show, we bring you news from all around the world, talking about global affairs, a disruptive and turbulent economy, political nationalism occurring all over the world, and on the heels of a very divisive midterm election. Before I begin my monologue, I first of all want to update everybody that Raphael Warnock has won the seat in Georgia, and the Democrats have held control of the United States Senate. The Republicans are very disappointed with this stunning loss, and it was a very, very close race. Today is Pearl Harbor Day, but before I begin my reflections on Pearl Harbor, I did want to say a word about one of the greatest tennis coaches in the world, Nick Bollettieri. Nick Bollettieri died at the age of 91 years of age. He was the coach to Serena and Venus Williams, Andre Agassi, Jim Courier, Monica Seles, worked with Boris Becker, and was consulting with top players from all around the world. This veteran in the United States Army in the late 1970s had an idea. He said, let's build a tennis place where people can train. So he went to the Colony Tennis Beach Resort and opened up a few tennis courts. He started a new way of training tennis players by having stations on each court, and he would train them, each court isolated on forehands, backhands, serves, and volleys. His academy concept went so well that eventually he bought land in Bradenton, Florida, and created the Nick Bollettieri Tennis Academy. The rest is history. Some of the greatest athletes in the world, some of them I mentioned, came right there and trained with Nick, and he sat by their side as they hoisted Grand Slam trophies over their heads. I had the honor of working with Nick Bollettieri in 2002 when he managed the Cary Tennis Center in Cary, North Carolina. All I can say about this man was his fiery, fiery heart, his passion for tennis, but most importantly, always looking at the 15 minutes in front of him and getting as much out of every minute as he possibly could. This is a man that would start his day at 5 a.m. and would end at 9 o'clock, walking every court in the Bollettieri Academy. I had the chance of training there a few summers when I was a junior tennis player, and it was amazing seeing the 100 courts. They called the back 40. The players were the players that weren't the top players in the world. And I remember being able to see Andre Agassi one day as a young boy hit balls with Bollettieri, and Jimmy Arias, another protege of Bollettieri. No one knew at that time that Andre would go on to win 8 Grand Slams, and he did. So we pray for all of the Bollettieri family, a true legend in the game of tennis, a tennis Hall of Famer, who lived his life much like a tennis match, one shot at a time. And on that note, we will be bringing some guests who worked with him next week at the IMG Academy. Now, I want to begin with my reflections on Pearl Harbor, and I'll shorten my remarks a bit so we begin the show. But today, December 7th, marks the anniversary of Pearl Harbor. 81 years ago, December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked the United States of America. 2,400 Americans dead, 1,178 wounded, 180 battleships destroyed. And President Franklin Delano Roosevelt said that it was a day of infamy and that the only thing to fear is fear itself. The United States of America, the next day, declared that they were entering World War II. And the greatest generation was born in America. Brave men who left their families, their loved ones, to fight in World War II. Their mission, plain and simple, fight for freedom and democracy and against authoritarianism and dictatorships. My grandfather, as Major S.V. Rao, was a major in World War II, and he fought the Japanese in Burma. So my family does have a connection. He fought for the British Army and then the Indian Army after partition. Before we begin the show, I just want to say that the most emotional moment for me was visiting Normandy with my wife and children a few years ago in France. And as we toured the beaches of Normandy, the story that brought tears to my eyes, the fact that young men when they came in on the amphibious landing, lost their lives within seconds, their body parts dismembered in the water. They would never see another sunset. But D-Day did happen, and America was victorious, and the world was victorious. The Allies were victorious. Today, I want to take a moment to salute those American heroes, the brave soldiers of our World War II generation. They are an everlasting reminder that they are the heroes who live among us. Forget the Avengers and the Marvel's movies that we watch. These were true Avengers, true heroes. They remind us, especially during dark and uncertain times, that Americans and the world can face adversity when we are united in our love of freedom and democracy. We think today of the people of Ukraine, who are not only fighting for their freedom, dying for their freedom. And that's what this great generation did. We will not retreat. We will prevail. We will continue to dream the impossible dream and reach the unreachable star. But we will only do that through faith, sacrifice, and unity. God bless the United States of America, and we want to pay homage and honor anyone who has a family member that was connected to the greatest generation. Please let us in, Mark, so we can begin the show. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, wonderful, guys. Well, first of all, we'll talk about Bollettieri in a second, and then the Warnock. But thanks for everyone being here today. Sorry, I got a little emotional at the end. It just kind of hit me when I went to the Veterans Memorial yesterday to shoot a video. And but Chris, I want you to talk about Pearl Harbor just for a few minutes, because it's a day that we don't really talk about much anymore. Somebody actually mentioned that to me on a Facebook post I did that said, do our children and grandchildren even know about this day? I mean, I when I turned the news on this morning, there was nothing mentioned about it, right? And so just what's your thoughts, and then just want to get everyone's thoughts about kind of World War II and just, what the world was going through at that time.
I have to really keep my cool about this, Steve, when you say that, because I'll tell you something. We talk about D-Day. Now, you took 1941 all the way to 1944 in a matter of a few seconds there. And the amount of people that died and the amount of people that did. But those are the two things, when we talk about Memorial Day, it's funny. We talk about Memorial Day on May, the end of May. And then a week later, it's kind of like, okay, we're back to normal. No, June the 6th should be celebrated, not celebrated, but memorialized every single year. I mean, we have to do that. And I'll tell you something. And I will say this on the air, and people can come and they can, do whatever they're going to do. But if the media existed the way it exists now in 1944, we'd all be speaking German or Japanese, because I'm telling you right now, social media and media in general would have plastered dead bodies all over the front pages of those newspapers. And people in the United States would have said, why are we doing this? We need to pull out of there. Why are we doing? All of a sudden, it would be just like, the pacifists. We had over, I think it was 1 million or 2 million people that were on a peace march. I mean, in the United States at that time, it was a very strong peace effort against, in World War II. So there are times everyone sits there and talks about war as if it's some romantic bullcrap thing. War is dead people. War is destruction. War is bombs. War is, it's a horrible. Nobody wants war. Nobody wants war. But we have to put ourselves in that national will, national aspect, and say, what is most important to us, and it's our way of life, and that's what we are protecting. So, Pearl Harbor was a disaster, and they go over it and over it and over it. And you know what it reminds me of? The 2020 election. Enough already. Pearl Harbor happened. It was absolutely a catastrophe. I think that we've learned somewhat lessons from that area. Others maybe we haven't. But the bottom line is that why we need to memorialize it, and we need to understand it, and we need to know that started our involvement in that war.
Dan,
so
Chris,
I'm sorry, Chris said two things. I just want to repeat. I agree with you. When you asked the question, why did we go to war? Then you also said to protect our way of life. I think that's very important to remember that.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I mean, we went to war because the bottom line is that Hitler had taken over the entire European continent. We still had not gone to war. We were providing lend-lease to the UK. We were doing, but we were out of it until Japan attacked. When Japan attacked us as part of the Axis, all of a sudden we had a situation that was irreconcilable. And what happened is a lot of people don't understand the countries that were allied with the Axis. Romania was allied with the Axis. They were with the Nazis. They helped to invade Russia, Soviet Union in World War II. So, I mean, there were a lot of countries. Ukraine, the top, everyone talks about denazification. There were 250,000 Ukrainians that sided with the Nazis in World War II. Now, I'm not saying we need to hold that over them. I'm just saying that's factual. So there's a lot of things that we have to take a look at. Australia, our friends, man, thank God. We had, if we wouldn't have had Australia, we would be speaking Japanese.
Yeah.
Because let me tell you, Australia, they were, and they've always been that way. Even in Europe, I've worked with Australians in the NATO area of Europe. And I sit there and I said, I hate to ask this, but why are you over here? And they said, we're over in Europe so that we don't end up being in Australia defending Australia. We're gonna help you guys defend here so that we don't have the enemy at the gates type of situation. So I mean, Steve, you bring up a good point, and I'll tell you, Pearl Harbor is something, and everyone talks about we need to apologize to the Japanese. Bull crap on that. Let me tell you something. 2 bombs wasn't enough. We should have, after that second bomb, they're the ones that sat there and said, we're going to defend to the last person in Japan. Okay, then we are going to destroy a city. And we destroyed 2 cities, 2 of them, until they finally said, okay, that's enough of that. So
just going to spend a minute each person just to give the reflections. Start with Shaquille because of your mention of Australia, then go to Dan Worthington, and then we're going to get into the Warnock race. The thing I forgot to mention today, live arguments begin in any minute on the Moore versus Harper case. I'm going to end my monologue today on Moore versus Harper, and then tomorrow we'll talk about what the court's decisions are on it. And I'm going to try to give more of a legal perspective in terms of, I've done some research about what the case is about, and then we'll see what the courts say. But Shaquille, your thoughts on Pearl Harbor?
Well, Chris, I think you made a bit of an inflammatory comment there that 2 bombs wasn't enough. Japan surrendered almost immediately after that. So the bombs are not there to hurt people. That's just to get a country to stop. So I think that was well more than enough. But I will also say that when the commission was headed up actually by Australians that actually headed up that commission, I think, I don't want to rewrite history. Certainly I wasn't there, and I seriously doubt that my family would have ever moved to Australia had the Japanese have taken over this great country. But I think it's a little bit unfair to just talk about what Japan did, in isolation. There have been many countries around the world that operated in very similar ways. The Japanese have been influenced by them and were basically trying to do, something that's very, very similar to what the Dutch did, what the British did, what the French did, etc. around the world. So I think to try to say that Japan, after being very isolationist for a long time, very insular, as it started to spread out in the world and try to become more imperial, I don't think that they acted dramatically different to the way the rest of us or the rest of our countries have. Having said that, this was a very sad day for the United States, of course, but probably in a strange way, a very happy day for Europe, because this was the precipice that caused the United States to actually enter in a real way into Europe after decades of the United States saying, we'll leave Europe to the Europeans. And I think that we still hear about some of these sort of debates today. Should the United States be the world's police force? Should the United States get involved in conflicts around the world? And earlier in the year when we've talked about this, I had sort of made the comment that if the United States doesn't, who does? For us to stand there and say we believe in certain things, certain human rights that are unalienable. We believe in that, but we're going to turn a blind eye and do nothing when we see millions of people attacking each other in other countries. Either we stand up for what we believe or we don't. Now, if we do stand up for what we believe, not only does that come at a financial cost to us, it also comes at a cost of lives for the people that we send over into these wars. And it also runs the risk that we can be alienating to some of those countries that feel as though we interfered in something that had nothing to do with us. But I still think that it's important that, especially the Five Eyes nations actually stand up and say, not on our watch. Human rights abuses are not going to happen on our watch. And that really goes for NATO as well. Dan.
I mean, Pearl Harbor was a very tragic day in the history of the United States. It is the thing that pushed us into the precipice into World War II. The United States could no longer maintain its essential neutrality. You had some people in the United States that were profiteering off the war, like Joe Kennedy and his family, were selling arms to the Germans, as we find out later. So it's very interesting. And the United States was not really, let's say, there was a lot of ambivalence over the Jewish question, which was sad because of the horrible things that the Jewish people suffered during the war, and their essentially they were trying to be eliminated, destroyed from the earth by the Nazis. All very, very sad. I agree with Steve that the Japanese got everything they deserved for what they did. They were very, very cruel to our men and women that were captured by them and put in their prison camps, including cannibalism and other things that they did, cruel experimentation, and torture, and in contravening the Geneva Convention protections. They didn't seem to want to follow the rules. All this was found out afterwards. So it was a horrible, horrible thing for our nation. And yes, we came forward finally to defend the freedom of our country. You mentioned that one of the reasons was to protect our way of life, our freedom, our values, and the liberty that we all cherish so much. And yet, look what's happening today. Our liberty, our freedom, our way of life is threatened, not from the outside, but from the inside, because of the political corruption that we have from outsiders, and from the moral decline of the American psyche, and the things that both parties are doing that undermine the rule of law and the safety of our society, including our own intelligence agencies, who are undermining the liberty and freedom that we hold so dearly.
Yeah.
And so, Pearl Harbor was a tragedy. Today, what we're seeing is an equal tragedy. And if Americans don't wake up, we're going to see what the Japanese tried to do to us and the Nazis tried to do to us become a reality because of our own politicians and their corruption.
And that's a good segue into the surprising. Yeah. Well, anyway, we wanted to take a few minutes to talk about Pearl Harbor because today is December 7th. Going to talk about Nick Bollettieri maybe tomorrow. I got one of the coaches coming to talk, and maybe Andy Andrews and some of the former pro tennis players have agreed to maybe come on and remember this great legend. Quite amazing that he coached 7 number ones in the world and revolutionized this whole academy concept. So before there was a Bollettieri, there really wasn't the way you trained that way. You didn't just train. And when I was a junior, actually changed the way training did. They just had big courts. There was a man named Bill Weimer who got us into tennis in West Virginia, and he basically took the same academy concept, and many top players came out of West Virginia. And then eventually the rest of the world saw what Bollettieri did, and Rafael Nadal and Tony Nadal started the Nadal Academy, which now train a lot of great players. So some people wonder whether the American tennis is now being hindered because you've got these academies all around the world that are training folks, where Carlos Alcaraz trained there as well, and he's number 4 in the world. But let's get into Rafael Warnock.
Before we do that, Stephen, I'm sorry. Since we got Sasha
Yeah,
here,
Sasha,
I wanted to
sorry.
bring up. That's okay. I got some. I have a share screen up. I don't know if you can put my share screen for his comments on this. So Ryazan, evidently the airfield at Ryazan was hit by a drone. The Ukrainians are kind of silent about it. I just point out this is Google Earth Pro, which is free of charge. Anybody can do this. And basically, I measured between Kyiv and Ryazan, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Hopefully, I am. Ryazan. And basically, it's about 480 miles. So this isn't even the border. So the border of Kyiv is here. So that right there is talking about you're talking about 300 miles. So they're hitting targets 400, 500 miles into Russian territory. And interestingly enough, you have Moscow right here, and there's the distance between Moscow and Ryazan is 107 miles. So literally all they had to do is go a little bit northwest. They could have actually hit Moscow. So this is the interesting part about it. If you take this and you go all the way, you come in all the way into the actual airfield. There's the airfield here. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner of this screen, I can tell you, I can get all the way down into the actual bombers, which are located at this site. And I can tell you where those bombers are all the way to latitude, longitude, all the way to seconds. So if I wanted to, I could have general vicinity of this area with that drone. So that's how easy it is to get this. And a lot of people sit there and say, well, this must be really complicated. It really isn't. It's like a 5th generation or 10th generation V2 rocket. That's basically, or a buzz bomb. That's basically what's going on. And it's interesting that the Ukrainians are sitting there saying, we don't have the bombers, but we're hitting blackjack, and they're hitting blackjack bomber sites. And a lot of people sit there and say, I don't understand the difference between a blackjack bomber. Here's a blackjack bomber up top. Here's our B-1B bomber here. Okay. Now, tell me if there's much difference between those. And they say, oh, there's so much different. But I think what happened is the Soviets stole the B-1B concept and just made it into the blackjack bomber. So
Sure.
You're talking about a very, very, multiple geometry winged type aspect here that they're hitting.
So I want to go to Sasha and sort of combine my World War II question to get it, and then get a Ukraine update, because I connected Ukraine and the fight for freedom and how Ukrainians are willing to also die for their freedom. And now you're talking about Pearl Harbor. So, Sasha, do you see a connection there as someone that grew up in the Ukraine, former Soviet Union, immigrated to Canada? Just what's your perspective about World War II and this whole notion of freedom and democracy and the sacrifices that many made in the Allied forces?
Well, yeah, you're right. There are a lot of similarities between when the U.S. was attacked by Japanese at Pearl Harbor without any declaration of war, and just doing this cowardly attack. Very similar happened with Russia on February 24th this year, when they attacked Ukraine on 3 different fronts without declaring the war, calling it a special operation, which is absolutely ridiculous term to call the outright invasion of an independent country. So you don't call it war, you don't call it invasion, you call it a special operation. What means special operation, actually? Now you can see it very clearly why they called it a special operation without actually meaning that at that time. Now that Ukraine is clearly taking over, from military point of view, Russia. It's very clear. It's happening everywhere. It's happening by their determination, by using a very effective use of U.S. and NATO weapons in a way that now U.S. and NATO are learning from Ukrainians what a wonderful way to use their modern weapons. But the way how to use it, making them even more lethal and more effective. That's what Ukraine done it.
Yeah, and so, Sasha, thank you for that. Any updates on Ukraine before we get into the aftermath of the Warnock election?
Yeah, just one more comment. And Sasha, you got to love this. When Russia sits there and accuses Ukraine of hitting civilian targets, within Russia, whenever they do that, it's kind of like, really? I mean, you're destroying the infrastructure of a country, and you're pissed off because you got a couple missiles by whomever, land on an oil platform or an oil area and blow up the oil area, and it's like, oh my God, how can you possibly? It reminds me of Nazi Germany, really. I mean, when the Brits went in there and bombed Berlin the one time with 2 bombs, and Hitler said, "You bomb us, we destroy you." I mean, it's just like Hitler, man.
Chris,
Putin needs
isn't that what's going on all the time between Israel and Gaza? They blame Israel for hitting civilian targets and accidentally, possibly, or maybe for a reason because that's where the bombs are coming from. Where Gaza does it on purpose, kindergartens and buses and hospitals.
I've seen them go after school buses. I've
Right.
seen them yes.
But they'll condemn Israel when they're not comparable.
Well, I do know one thing about Israel is right now they're staying very clear of the Ukrainian conflict. They're kind of staying clear of that whole thing because and I don't know whether there's secret deals going on there. I don't know that because I'm not privy to that type of thing. I think that they want to support Ukraine, but they're still kind of pushing that aside because they don't want to get involved. Because they get involved, then Syria's going to get involved, then everyone's going to get. I mean, although Syria's already involved.
Chris, I want to mention something. It's changing right now simply because of the alliance between Russia and Iran. And Iran is the great threat to Israel.
It is.
And other countries too.
Yeah, that's right. And so right now the situation and public opinion in Israel is very heavily on the side of Ukraine.
Yes.
And they really believe that they must help Ukraine at all costs, especially that Israel has an expertise in
counterterrorism,
air missile defense, and other areas. So they could definitely help. And the question is, of course, what would be a U.S. reaction on that? But I don't think that U.S. will object to that because U.S. helping Ukraine itself anyway, and U.S. is very strongly against Iran.
Please join. Well, real quickly, we got only 30 minutes for the show. We've got to get into the meaty stuff. And of course, it's going to get a little heated. I'm going to be graceful in my moderation here as the host of the show, but and I'm sorry.
We'll see.
I know. Go ahead, Steve. You've been fighting a bit on this for the last 15 minutes.
Last night, but I think Donald Trump and the extremists must be just shocked that Warnock did pull off a victory. This is a blow to I think the Republicans and DeSantis.
Steve, I got a question for you about the victory last night.
Good news for Joe Biden. I do think Biden will win again, and I think Biden.
Steve, we need to talk about the election.
I love your optimism, man.
First of all, Herschel Walker probably wasn't the best candidate. I mean, come on, guys.
Yeah, he was not the best candidate.
No. Herschel Walker.
I'm going to jump.
Wait, Chris, just a second. Let's go. Steve,
Walker, guys. He had like
Steve, aside. Putting Herschel Walker aside for a minute, Steve. How is it they're able to have an election so quickly for the senator? We have results already in. Where are the ballots that they have to be counted? Where are the mail-in ballots, the absentee ballots?
Georgia, I think, does them a lot quicker, but it was just a runoff election. That's it.
Oh, I see.
It's a statewide election. Why can't that be for all states?
Oh, there you go again. It was
But Lee, Lee, as I understand, and I think this might have even been
I'm not
a
saying there's
Brian
fraud. I'm
Kemp
saying is, my
decision and
point is,
everything,
Mark,
but what this was
Mark,
a
Mark,
quick
Mark.
election and everything, and I've even
Yeah,
said that
I can
before.
only like
But I
say
don't know
quick.
why they made it so quick, because it was a very quick election that they decided to do the runoff that fast and all
Yeah, do that
in
for every
that
election,
space.
Mark.
And
That's
I
my
think
point.
that was actually a
Yeah,
state
they
decision,
called it
but I'm
a
not
one,
sure of
right?
that.
That was a quick one. Well, Herschel Walker get back to doing whatever he was doing, but I did watch
And
him. I
Warnock
did
will just
enjoy
go
watching
back to
him play
whatever he
football.
was doing.
So,
What?
so can I want to jump
Yeah,
in here.
please.
I'm not sure you want that, Dan.
Shaquille,
I
please,
know
your
that.
analysis.
You,
Why did he
you,
lose?
make comments like with a sort of grin on your face about, oh well, the Donald Trump and the extremists, and then you sit there and you go, can't understand why the country's not unified. I just can't think of a reason. And then you've got the far right part of the Republicans saying, you know, the Democrats and the wokesters, and they can't understand why the country's not unified. So you say that Herschel Walker wasn't a good candidate. Yeah, I agree with you that he had a lot of issues, especially with his anti-abortion stance.
Baggage.
And Raphael
Yeah.
Warnock did a good
Baggage.
job of attacking him for that. But what, was Raphael Warnock a good candidate?
No.
Is
Yeah,
Fetterman a good candidate?
He
up
was
in
well
Pennsylvania?
spoken.
No.
He was
So-
well spoken. I
so
mean,
this
he
kind
had
of-
some
Like
this
Right.
Biden, the candidate? No.
You know, now I will say that yes, Donald Trump supporting Herschel Walker may well have hurt him. I'm surprised that the Libertarian vote didn't go more his way from the last election. I'm also surprised that the northern suburbs of Atlanta seem to be trending much more blue than what they ever have before. So that comes as a surprise to me, because areas like Milton and the northern parts of Alpharetta, you know, Fullerton County, you know, most of those, that's a very wealthy and a somewhat rural area. It's a semi-rural area, certainly. So I'm surprised to see that trend occurring. But that's been the result. It is a big blow to the Republicans. And I think the Republicans' messaging on a number of things is going to have to change before the next election. I think that the political right parties of the world, I've said this before in recent weeks, have really missed the boat when it comes to renewable energy, climate change, that sort of thing. And they're standing silent when you see things ridiculous like what's just happened in Oxford in the United Kingdom, where they're proposing to have restrictions on how often you can leave the area that you live in, right? That they're going to actually register your vehicle and you can't leave more than twice a week, and that sort of thing. Now, and then the politicians that proposed this actually said, we will do this whether the people like it or not. So a complete affront to democracy. I would suggest that it's time for centre-right parties to actually come up with some real workable plans. If they think that they can do things more economically, then they've got to talk about, like I always talk about, geothermal and hydropower. They need to say, this is how we're going to get from point A to point B, because it's very, very clear that this is something that's important. I don't think racial equity, let me finish, Mark. I don't think that racial equity is quite as important as what people think it is. And certainly I think the economy is, but the Republicans have done a poor job of it. Having said that, Mark, just before you do, having said that, Chris Greco has talked about the LGBTQ community and what a great supporter he is. So in honor of Chris's comments yesterday, I have in fact got the shirt that I was going to wear yesterday as promised. Okay, Chris? So there you go. There it is.
Biden to quit.
But no, well, that's just wrong on all kinds of levels.
cute.
But Shaquille and Steve, you'll be very interested in knowing this. Part of the reason of being late on this morning was the other job actually had me watching a film, and there was a big film event yesterday. It was actually interesting watching the person that was the focus of the film. It is actually a film called The Holly, and it's actually about Denver, Colorado, and an activist in Denver, Colorado. But something that you oftentimes say that you wish people would do actually was quite interesting, because apparently the gentleman is the subject of that movie, who is had been involved in the gang culture and stuff like that in Colorado, and is now very much involved in the fight against the gangs and all in that space. Terrence Roberts was doing more of that kind of centrist message and moderate message that we say we want politicians to do, because apparently he's running for mayor or possibly in that area at some point or another, or at least he's expressed some interest in doing that. But even in talking about like the police, he was made it very clear, I do not want to defund the police. I'm quoting him and everything, but I want police accountability, which even Lee and other folks have said that they have no problem with it and everything in that nature. And even when he brought up some of the stuff around housing, because apparently Denver has a very big housing issue, he was talking about the nature of housing and how there's a lot of prefab housing that goes out there and how quickly that housing goes up and some of the problems that go on with that. So he was actually bringing up some very valid points in that space, and even some of the economics. He's talking about how if you drive by those cities, you'll turn around and 1 minute you'll not see any house, and the next minute it's up there very quickly. And those prefab houses aren't the best kind of houses in general, even though I did recently hear about some prefab houses in California that are apparently becoming the big trend, because you can even do prefab guest housing. And that wasn't from his whole thing that he was talking about, but something that I also had read as well. And then he brought up some of the things around homelessness. And yes, he did get into that favorite topic of ours, rice and everything, because apparently Denver has a homeless population of about 10,000 people, of which 40% are minorities and all of that, even though the population is about 10% in that particular city and everything. So I thought that he brought up some very good points. And like I said, he was just there for a question and answer. He's in Durham, North Carolina. He's not in Denver. So whether he says those kind of things in Denver or not, that would be interesting. But I did find it interesting because as I was listening to him, I was thinking about some of the things that we talk about. And even he brought up a fact that was actually kind of scary. And I'm not going to admit it, because even some of my friends that were watching the same event were like, that's a scary thought, because he was talking about the gang issues that exist in Durham and how he had been to Durham before and all in that space. And he had also lived and spent some time advocating in Watts and other places that are notoriously bad, like Cabrini Green and other things. And he actually said that in his view, the projects here in Durham, North Carolina were worse than those in Watts, because Watts has actually done some improvement and all in that space. So as one that is a Durham resident, that was kind of a scary statement to hear from somebody that's traveled around the world and all in that sense. But it was just interesting in my mind. And like I said, I could be wrong, and I'm just kind of giving a summary of what he said. But it just seemed like he was taking more of a...
One second, Mark, I just want to ask you a quick question. You used the term minority. What's the definition of the word minority?
Minorities are usually seen as those that are in a group separate from the majority population. Majority population are usually those that are in a lot of senses European American and all of that, but you can break down minority groups into ethnic groups as well. So definitely in that case, Italians and others could be seen as minority depending on how you do the definition. But usually when folks say
Caucasian or white people too,
about right? A group separate from the majority.
So white people can be a minority also, could they not? In certain areas of the country?
I said minority can also be broken down into ethnicities. Italians can be considered a minority. Irish can be considered a minority. It can be depending on how the definition is given and all of that. So yes, it can be used as within the field of ethnicity as well. But historically speaking, that is not the way it is used and all that. I mean, for example, you can be just to give an example. You can be the minority. Yes, you said, can white folks be a minority? Totally. There is even that's what part of the argument around. Well, not around, but with affirmative action, because I've talked a couple of times about HBCUs. I'm a fan of HBCUs. I've had friends and family members, including the parents that have been involved in those universities, and definitely my brother and others, and all in that space. But some of those schools have become very well known for certain kind of departments. Like I said, Central has a very strong law department and also a very strong drama department. And yes, some students that are European American find that, and then they decide to enter, and they enter under a minority scholarship. So yes, you can even be a minority going into an HBCU and all of that, because they get a minority scholarship if they go to said HBCU, because they are not the majority of the students. The majority of the students at the HBCU are going to be African American students.
Mark, when you talk about homelessness and you bring up race into that,
no problem.
Well, there's only 10% of the population that are minorities, but yet 40% of them are homeless. Okay, that may well be true. I don't think it's caused because of systemic racism. And even if it was, the solutions that I often see proposed have nothing to do with reducing homelessness overall. What they want to do is increase the proportion of white homeless people. in order to get racial equality amongst the homeless. This is ridiculous. Okay,
As you listen to what I just said, the gentleman actually is involved in the prefab kind of system, and he's also a what do you call it, an inspector and everything. So some of the solutions he were offering were not trying to increase the amount of white homeless. That would be actually ridiculous and everything, or do anything along those lines. It was actually to attack the issue of homelessness at its core and to actually try to make everybody have fair housing and all in that space. And I think that's what most people in the homeless space do. And I've actually had friends that I've been involved with Occupy. I've said that before. I've been involved with other things in the homeless space. So I don't think anybody's trying to do that in society. I just think that would be plain stupid and everything. So I don't think that that's a issue going on. I did have just a quick.
No, I'm not hanging on for you to go on to a different topic when you interrupted me. So just let me finish.
Okay.
The issue is that when things are targeted towards minorities to reduce their rates, it has the effect of proportionately increasing the rates of whites. This is silly. California had this campaign a few trips ago when I was in California, where they said one in seven homeless people in California are women. We need to reduce the rate of women. I'm like, what about the 6 men? You know, it's this sort of thing where they try to bring attention to an issue, and they separate away the issue of of everybody who's suffering in order to favour particular groups. But I do want to just come back to this election, if you don't mind, because that was what we were talking about.
No, you can come back to the election. I did have something I was going to ask Chris really quickly, since I saw Chris here, and it was something unrelated. But yeah, go back to the election. I would counter what you were saying about the those kind of programs, because I don't think that I've ever heard of a homeless program that specifically targets one group over another.
Before we get off the election,
doesn't disadvantage white people. So I mean,
just give me 1 second. I really want to hit this Warnock thing.
It's not a show on race. We got to get back on track.
Go ahead and put my share screen on there. I got to show you something here. So this is a story that was done by NBC News, and basically it says something like, hey, you know, Spelman College, which is an HBCU, right?
Yes.
So she's now this is scary. This is not just any young woman. This is a 21-year-old international studies major, right? So she had been told months earlier by fellow students about a law that does not allow students from private colleges and universities in the state to use their school ID as identification to vote. A rule she believed would prevent her from casting a ballot in Georgia. She actually cast a ballot at the midterms in her home state of New York. Now, what do you read here? I read a 21-year-old student who doesn't know enough to look up the law or to ask somebody in the Georgia representative. She's got a representation in Georgia because she's a student. You know, why is it? And yet, now that Warnock has won, this story has gone away. I haven't seen it at all. Nothing. And I'll tell you what happens if Walker would have run. By God, this would have been plastered on every single news everywhere.
But Chris, there was another story that I saw. But Chris, there was another story that I saw that was.
Just scroll back up to the top, because I want to have a look at this photograph. This is what we're talking about. This is what I'm talking about. You focus so much on race. You have convinced this generation that the whole world is against them. There is no white representation here, and fair enough, it's an HBCU, but there's no white representation, and everything is being distilled down to race, Mark. And for you to try to tell me that that's not happening in America, I've been all over your beautiful country. It's happening in America. It's spilling over into other nations. Don't tell me that this race baiting isn't occurring.
But the flip side of that is I saw one and I started bringing it up a couple of. Hold on a second. The flip side of that is that there was a article, and I started bringing it up a couple of days ago. Maybe I'll find it again, where there was a white student. I forgot where they were from. I think they were up in one of the northern universities and everything, and they basically were quote unquote deprogrammed because they felt that when they had gone to whatever that university that they were, that they had been gotten a lot of what you would consider indoctrination and types of indoctrination. So then they were basically lauded because it was whatever press article I was reading. They were lauded because they had all of a sudden been awoken on the other side and therefore deprogrammed and all in that space. And yes, I'm using that kind of language intentionally when I say deprogramming, because for a minute there, they were all about, the kind of issues, whether it's LGBTQI rights and a number of other things that they said that they were being taught in the university and everything. But ironically, as soon as they got out of college, then all of a sudden they've been put up there as a hero because they have been all of a sudden awoken, and now they are in the other sense, and now they have been quote unquote deprogrammed. And that was like one of those. It wasn't like Harvard or Yale, but it was one of those like more women colleges, but definitely. I'm trying to think of it. It's not Wesleyan, but it's one of those type of universities that have a history of being more geared toward the women population and all in that way. But it was just interesting that y'all just brought that article up, and I had actually meant to bring the other article up like about 2 or 3 days ago, because I'm going like, what the hell is this? When there's people that are having this whole kind of you find somebody, and I've seen it done, Dan, hate to say this, but I've even seen it done in religious communities when somebody is all of a sudden awakened, and then they are told that they have been, kind of deprogrammed or had their views changed and everything in that way. And I've seen it done that along a lot of spectrums. It can be Muslims, it can be Christians, it can be a number of other.
I'm going to get us back on track. We'll come back to this later.
I do have a couple of comments here on this election that
yeah. Well, I want to just close out with my analysis. I do want to spend a few minutes talking about the event I attended. I had the honor of meeting the Minister of China, from the embassy in Morrisville, and attended a great event I want to talk about today on ping pong diplomacy. It was the 50th anniversary of ping pong diplomacy. But real quickly, I wanted to say my analysis of this election is that I think Donald Trump's endorsements and involvement in these elections has clearly hurt the Republican Party. And I think the Republicans are in a dilemma because I do believe that Trump will be the nominee of the party.
I don't think so.
I do believe he will win the Trump.
Prediction right now, no.
He will, though. He will, because all he needs is
DeSantis. We're thinking DeSantis against Biden, and not a rerun, because I'm actually thinking it could be Trump against Biden.
It's not going to be DeSantis versus Trump. It's going to be DeSantis. There's going to be 5 Republicans that run. The non-Trump vote will be divided. You only need 30% to win a primary. That's what he did in 2020. He will be the nominee. The only Democrat that can defeat Trump is Joe Biden. That's what the poll shows. If Biden can hold on and win the presidency, then he can resign in 2 years after that. Kamala Harris
on light support.
I got to shuffle. Where am I? Is it Labor Day?
Joe Biden can defeat. Joe Biden. The only way Trump can beat Biden.
They're going to prop him up.
Like he's been getting.
I mean, he can. Joe Biden's
No.
incumbent.
I hear what you're saying.
All of you are underestimating the development of the medicine in the United States. And I think with all the latest developments, Biden can rule for another 16 years easily, because 96 is not such a big. I mean, 20 years ago it was.
Now, if the Constitution allowed it. If the Constitution allowed the former president of the United States to come back as a vice president, imagine if it was Biden Obama.
We're gonna flip. That's an interesting thought.
Coming back to this coming back to this Senate race, I think that it's well worth noting in Georgia, as it is in many other states, this argument that people have when they start talking about getting rid of the Electoral College in favor of the popular vote. Okay, what we've seen, and you don't have to just look at Georgia. Go to the neighboring state of Alabama. What you see is that the big population concentrated places, like the big cities, is where you're getting the big Democrat votes. If you have a look at the landmass of Georgia, the overwhelming majority of Georgia is voting for the Republicans. Same thing with Alabama. Same thing with South Carolina.
Most of the country.
New York also, Sekio.
Absolutely. I'm talking about red states at the moment. So you are seeing that. Now, when you go across to blue states like New York and California, it's much more pronounced. The overwhelming majority of California in relation to landmass votes red. But those big population centers like LA and San Francisco, etc., are where all the votes are going to the Democrats. So this is becoming, I think, even more divisive than what it has been. It's always been an issue in American politics, but it's becoming even more divisive because many of those rural voters have got different needs and different requirements from government. They need different things, and they're not getting it, and their voice is getting drowned out. If you empower them to have more of a voice in Congress, what that means is, unfortunately, the people that live in those high density, city areas will have their voices drowned out by the interests of often rural places and farming communities. There has to be a balance, and I don't think that making an enemy of people is the way to do it.
There is a rural-urban divide. There is a rural-urban divide, and we see this in
major.
Donald Trump has his candidates haven't done very well, which is true, but it's not as though there's not the majority of the landmass of the country that are voting for him or voting for his candidates. That's still the case, even though these results have been very, very tight. We're not talking about a lot of votes. We're talking about 100,000 votes in Georgia being the difference here. We're talking about, when in 2020, we're talking about 30, 40,000 votes across 3 states. So, this is, I think, an important thing to take into account. And what I will say about your commentary about Ron DeSantis. At the moment, what's very interesting is how the international betting markets are pricing things in. They're pricing Ron DeSantis as the 3-1 or the 2-1 shot to be the next president. They're actually saying that Ron DeSantis has a better chance of taking the Republican nomination than Donald Trump. I don't agree with that personally, but they are also saying that Ron DeSantis would be a shoo-in to win the election against Joe Biden, which, again, I'm not necessarily sure, but I don't think that would run Joe Biden against Ron DeSantis. So, but I'm not so persuaded, Steve, that if it was a Donald Trump, Joe Biden rematch, that it's just going to be, it's just going to be easy and Joe Biden, it's going to be a walk in the park. I think that you are overestimating.
Maybe one thing that we should think before that I got to begin my talk about China real quick. But the one thing is maybe we need to go back to the way it was before, when the top 2 would be the president and vice president. So if it was Trump Biden and Trump won, it'd be Trump Biden. If it was Biden won and Trump was, it'd be Biden Trump. I mean,
but going back to reality, I think that the more likely outcome would be that Biden would leave office, and that it would.
Yeah, Steve, the problem with that is personalities also.
Yeah, personality conflicts, that would definitely be an issue. Shaquille, you rattled something. I know you got to get to China, and we got to wind up. I was actually going to get something that I was going to ask Chris about, and sorry that I was late in all of that space, but we can bring that up tomorrow. But I'll just throw it out as a conversation. But it's interesting you bring up the urban rural divide, because that's one of the news stories that I found earlier today, because apparently here in North Carolina, a lot of the chicken farmers, the poultry farmers, are upset because they have found, and it comes to something else that we talked about, which is the influence of big corporations, because they have found that they feel that they are in a system that almost amounts to sharecropping, because they are having to spend a lot of money to raise the chickens and then are not getting the returns that they were promised, because they were promised that they would get significant amounts of returns, and then they found that they are in an industry that is more expensive than they were expecting it to be. And as I was reading the article, I was going like, this sounds like sharecropping. And ironically, as I was reading the article, it had nothing to do, because a lot of these farmers were of all ethnicities and everything. So the article I was reading was actually focusing on a number of folks from like rural North Carolina that were in different communities and all over society. But it'll be interesting, and if folks want to go back and read that article, I'll do more studying. But as I was looking, it definitely sounded like what is being complained about was similar to the old sharecropping system, where you have to put in a lot of money and you find yourself in a constant state of debt that you can't get out of. And that's what these chicken farmers were complaining about. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
I don't think it's fair to equate that to sharecropping. Sharecropping in the context of the United States and newly freed slaves may have been, and more than likely would have been, something that was probably abusive. But the idea of farming families renting land from people who owned it in return for giving them a share of their crops as opposed to paying rent, that's not unusual. That's been done and continues to be done all over the world. So
the way that it was described, and like I said, I know Steve's got to get to his Chinese stuff and everything, but the way it was described is they didn't know when they were going into it, and these for all kinds of families, all kinds of different ethnicities, all kinds of different societies, was they didn't know how much it would cost. There was big corporations that they were going to, whether it was Tyson or everything, that had not actually given them a fair education. We're talking about education earlier as to what they were stepping into. So they found them in being up in constant debt and definitely were found in that kind of trap situation.
Yeah,
That's why I was making a fair level.
What makes it different? The companies were able to forecast what those prices are. I've got a very good friend of mine who's having to write off, almost $10 million in expenses because the cost of laying electricity cables has gone up since he got those contracts in 2019. It's just the cost of doing business. When he's making money, he doesn't give thanks to the government. He doesn't blame the government when he's not. I mean, what do you want? All right, save China.
Yeah, guys, time real quickly. I just took 2 minutes. I'm going to spend on this, and then I'm going to go right into the closeout. But China, because I don't want to have time to close out on Moore v. Harper, but China just made some loosening up in their COVID restrictions, their zero COVID policy, largely due to the protests. So we're going to talk about that tomorrow. And speaking of China, the event I attended was fascinating, celebrating the 50th anniversary of ping pong diplomacy, hosted by the Carolina Chinese Chamber of Commerce. And this celebrated in the 1970s when the United States and China exchanged table tennis players. Actually happened by mistake. They were playing the World Championships in Nagoya, Japan, and a man by the name, I think his name was Gerald, I think it was Cohen, I forgot his name, but a U.S. player actually got on the Chinese bus by mistake and ended up meeting a Chinese table tennis player. When they got off the bus, it was the first time in the history that they'd seen a China player and a U.S. player together, or athletes. And then eventually they invited the table tennis team to China, which actually opened up diplomacy between the two countries. Quite amazing that sports in many ways could be often used to unify, even though sometimes we're seeing it divide when you're looking at a lot of the athletes and the things about bowing, not kneeling down when they play the national anthem and stuff. But we'll come back to that next week. Yeah. But it was pretty amazing. And but I want to just close out real quickly on Moore v. Harper, and we'll just sort of open it up before we exit the show. But today, and we'll talk about ping pong diplomacy tomorrow and Friday. But today they're hearing oral arguments for Moore versus Harper. And so I've done my research, and basically this case was brought by the Speaker of the House, Tim Moore, in North Carolina. And it's basically about when the Republicans drew the maps in 2020. The Supreme Court of North Carolina struck down those maps, and then the appeal courts upheld the new maps that were drawn by the special master, and those were the seats that were in our midterm election. Now, the Speaker brought a case called Moore versus Harper to the United States Supreme Court that basically says that the Supreme Court of North Carolina or any state court does not have the right to guarantee a federal election. So they're basing their theory on the independent legislature theory, that when legislatures draw maps, that they basically, or those maps are final, and that the Supreme Court can come in. So we're going to see what we don't understand why the court took the case, but they are making their arguments.
I can give you an idea of why they took it. Right, the same reason why they decided the Rucho case in 2019 in North Carolina was that particular case had to do with gerrymandering along racial lines in breach of the Voter Rights Act. This is about gerrymandering along political lines. There's nothing in federal or state rules that say that you can't do it. Now, I don't like it. I'm not a citizen of your country, but I don't like that kind of idea. I don't think that our country should be doing it. I think Canada should be doing it. And I think that most Americans should be appalled that this kind of thing is going on. But that's the reality. California's done that. New York's done that to favor the Democrats. So, the reality is that the state courts cannot come in and impose their will on an equal branch of government. This has already been ruled on by the Supreme Court. I'd be very surprised if Moore v. Harper was decided differently to how it's previously been decided.
But Shaquille, I know I'm tossing it back to Steve really quick, and it's going to be two very minute sentences and everything, if that, probably 30 seconds. But Shaquille, isn't part of the problem also money? Because that's one of the things that Terrence also brought up, because all of those gang programs were getting money in on a constant basis, and then the money goes into the people's pockets and not into the actual programs and all along those lines. So that's one of the things that was brought up and everything. But I think that part of it is, like you just said, it's a political football that is going out and everything.
Nothing to do with this case. This case is not about money. It's not about election reform. This case is solely about really whether independent state legislature theory, which is that the state legislatures have ultimate control over the drawing of the districts, or can this be appealed to a state court? And short of clear violations of the law, such as breaching the Voting Rights Act, no, this belongs to the states. And I don't even think a federal constitutional amendment could change that, because this was part of the negotiation when the states joined the unions. This is clearly something defined in the 10th Amendment, in my opinion. And based on the other rulings that the Supreme Court, both in its current makeup and its previous makeup, the rulings that they have made in recent times and over the decades seems to support that. I'd be very surprised.
Well, guys, we have to wrap up. We have to wrap up because I've got to leave. But those courts, if you want to go listen to the oral arguments, they're on the U.S. Supreme Court website. Just do Google U.S. Supreme Court oral arguments, and you can actually hear the oral arguments. And hopefully tomorrow they'll render whatever is going to decision, maybe in a few weeks. We're going to talk about this and other matters and ping pong diplomacy, because I think it's interesting to see how the two countries came together. And maybe it's time to look at relationship building face to face in America and between nations, so that diplomacy isn't done through social media and technology, which I think was one thing we learned from the ping pong diplomacy. But from our family to yours, wishing everyone a happy holidays and wherever you are. And we'll be back tomorrow and Friday. Thank you.
Take care. God bless.